What makes deep thinkers so different? Jung's depth psychology. Have you ever felt like your thoughts go deeper than most people can follow? Like you live in a world inside your head, beautiful, complex, and sometimes painfully lonely. Carl Jung once said, "Your vision becomes clear only when you look into your heart." In this video, we'll explore the secret world of deep thinkers, why their minds work differently, why they struggle to fit in, and how their depth connects to the ancient patterns of the collective unconscious. If you've ever felt misunderstood because of how deeply you think, this is your story. Part 1. The inner architecture of deep thinkers. Deep thinkers live in a world that most people never enter. Their minds are not content with the surface of things. They are drawn to meanings, to patterns, to the invisible threads that connect one event to another. Jung would say they are introverted intuitives, people who naturally turn inward not to escape reality but to decode it. Their thoughts are not random or impulsive. They are part of an inner system, an architecture built through reflection, curiosity, and a relentless search for understanding. For them, thinking is not a task, it is a form of existence. Carl Jung believed that people differ not only by personality, but by the direction of their psychic energy, outward extraversion or inward introversion. Deep thinkers channel their energy inward. They find vitality not in outer stimulation but in inner exploration. While others draw meaning from interaction, they find meaning in solitude. Jung considered this inwardness not as isolation, but as a dialogue with the unconscious, a process through which symbols, dreams, and intuitions arise. For the deep thinker, the unconscious is not an enemy. It is an entire ecosystem waiting to be understood. Their thoughts are rarely linear. Instead, they move in circles, spirals, or labyrinths. What appears to others as overthinking is to them a method of reaching essence. They often pause at moments most people would overlook, a gesture, a silence, a metaphor in a sentence, because to the deep thinker everything carries psychic weight. Jung's concept of the psyche encompasses both conscious awareness and unconscious influence, and deep thinkers live right at that intersection. Their consciousness constantly interacts with hidden material, forgotten memories, unspoken fears, archetypal images, and translates them into reflection. To think deeply is to live with tension. Jung called it the tension of opposites, the psychological conflict between the conscious ego and the unconscious depths. Deep thinkers often feel this tension vividly. They sense contradictions within themselves, a desire to belong and an equal desire to withdraw, a yearning for clarity and an attraction to mystery. In Jungian psychology, this tension is not a flaw but a signal of inner growth. The psyche evolves when opposites are held together without one destroying the other. Deep thinkers unconsciously perform this alchemy, transforming confusion into insight and solitude into wisdom. But this psychological sophistication comes at a cost. To navigate such depth, they must detach from the noise of the collective. Jung warned that society rewards adaptation, not reflection. The deep thinker who lives primarily in the inner world can appear impractical or detached. Yet this detachment is not avoidance. It is the psyche's way of preserving its integrity. When too immersed in collective thinking, the individual self weakens. Deep thinkers intuitively resist that pull. They sense that meaning must be discovered, not imposed. So they retreat, not because they dislike people, but because they must protect the dialogue between ego and self. Jung described the self as the organizing center of the entire psyche, the totality that includes both conscious and unconscious elements. Deep thinkers are in many ways driven by this self. Their reflections, questions, and obsessions are not random mental activity, but expressions of the self seeking realization. Every time they dive into thought, they are attempting to bring the unconscious into consciousness, to integrate fragments of their psyche into a more coherent whole. This is what makes their inner lives so intense. They are not merely thinking, they are becoming. In Jung's typology, introverted intuition (ni) and introverted thinking (ti) often dominate the deep thinker's psychology. Introverted intuition perceives unseen connections, while introverted thinking analyzes internal logic. Together, these functions create a personality that sees the world symbolically and interprets it analytically. When Jung wrote about intuition, he described it as perception via the unconscious, the ability to grasp underlying principles rather than concrete facts. Deep thinkers do not rely solely on empirical observation. They read the invisible. They sense where an idea is heading before others do. This can make them visionary but also misunderstood, since they articulate truths that others haven't yet recognized. Their lives are filled with patterns of introspection. They often revisit the same memories not out of obsession but because they sense unfinished meaning. Jung argued that the unconscious speaks in symbols, and that repetition is the psyche's way of drawing attention to what must be integrated. For the deep thinker, repetitive thought is not a malfunction, it's communication. Their mind circles around an idea until it transforms into understanding. This is how they metabolize reality. Deep thinkers also possess a peculiar relationship with time. They often drift between past and future, reconstructing experiences or anticipating possibilities. Jung associated this with the intuitive function's non-linear perception, a tendency to see time as a psychological field rather than a sequence. This gives deep thinkers an almost prophetic sensitivity. They sense the future forming within the present. Yet this same gift can burden them with anxiety because they perceive possibilities that others ignore. They carry not just their own worries but the collective ones as well. Socially, deep thinkers live at the edge of the collective unconscious. Jung described the collective unconscious as a shared layer of the psyche that contains universal archetypes, timeless images such as the hero, the mother, the shadow, and the sage. Deep thinkers are often attuned to these archetypes without realizing it. They sense universal meanings in personal experiences. When they watch a sunset, they don't just see light fading, they perceive the symbolism of endings, transformation, and death. When they listen to someone's pain, they hear echoes of ancient suffering that belong not only to that person but to humanity itself. This depth of perception makes them natural philosophers, artists, or spiritual seekers, but it can also isolate them from everyday conversation, which often feels painfully superficial. Jung noted that introverts possess a rich subjective world, but struggle with external adaptation. The deep thinker's world is one of depth, nuance, and ambiguity, qualities that society tends to overlook in favor of speed and certainty. This mismatch creates internal conflict. They long to share their insights, but language feels inadequate. The more they know, the less they can explain. Jung once wrote, "The deeper the experience of an insight, the harder it is to communicate." Deep thinkers live inside this paradox. They feel full of meaning but starved of connection. Their empathy also runs deep, though not always visibly. While they may appear detached, they often feel the emotional undercurrents of a situation before anyone speaks. Jung's concept of the feeling function refers to value judgments, how we determine what matters. Deep thinkers, even when not emotionally expressive, possess refined feeling values. They evaluate not by popularity but by authenticity. They are drawn to people and ideas that resonate with inner truth. This gives them a kind of moral intuition, an internal compass that guides them toward integrity, but it also makes them intolerant of falseness, which can lead to conflict or withdrawal. At their core, deep thinkers are seekers of unity. Jung's theory of individuation, the process of integrating all aspects of the psyche, describes their unconscious journey. While others seek comfort in conformity, the deep thinker seeks wholeness. They are not satisfied with partial truths. They want to understand why they exist, what consciousness is, and how meaning is formed. This quest is not purely intellectual, it is existential. Each thought becomes a step toward integration. Every question, even if unanswered, refines their connection to the self. Yet there is a hidden irony. The more deeply they think, the more aware they become of their limitations. They realize that intellect cannot capture total truth. Jung often warned that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous because it inflates the ego. Deep thinkers constantly risk this inflation, the belief that they can grasp the infinite. However, those who mature through reflection learn humility. They begin to sense that wisdom lies not in knowing everything, but in honoring the mystery. Their thoughts then evolve from analysis to contemplation, from dividing the world to uniting with it. Their inner lives also include encounters with what Jung called the numinous experiences of awe, transcendence, or divine presence. For the deep thinker, such moments occur not necessarily through religion, but through profound insight. When they grasp a universal truth or see order emerge from chaos, they experience what Jung described as the religious function of the psyche, the soul's recognition of something greater than the ego. This is why many deep thinkers, even without formal faith, carry a quiet spirituality. Their religion is understanding, their worship is awareness. Because they perceive life symbolically, they also experience pain symbolically. A failure to them is not just a setback, but an initiation. A heartbreak becomes an opportunity for transformation. Jung viewed suffering as the crucible of individuation, the place where the ego confronts its limitations and opens to the self. Deep thinkers with their reflective minds rarely escape suffering. They analyze it, dissect it, and in doing so often prolong it. Yet over time they discover that pain contains wisdom. It forces them to descend into themselves to find meaning where others see only loss. In relationships, deep thinkers seek depth over comfort. They crave conversations that reveal the soul, not small talk that fills silence. Jung would associate this with the dominance of introverted intuition and feeling functions that value authenticity and symbolic connection. Such people form few bonds but strong ones. They are often misunderstood as cold when in truth they are cautious with energy. For them, intimacy is sacred. They cannot open their inner world to someone who doesn't sense its gravity. When they do connect, it is total merging of minds that feels almost spiritual. The inner architecture of deep thinkers is thus both a sanctuary and a labyrinth. Inside them lives a vast library of thoughts, symbols, and questions. Jung believed that every individual carries an inner world as rich as any external one, but few ever explore it. Deep thinkers are those few. They traverse the corridors of their psyche with both wonder and fear. They are not content to live unconsciously. Every emotion becomes data, every experience a text to interpret. Their minds are both microscope and telescope, examining details while perceiving cosmic patterns. Jung's archetype of the sage captures the essence of this personality. The sage seeks truth beyond illusion, often at the expense of comfort. But Jung warned that identifying too much with an archetype can distort the psyche. When the deep thinker clings to the identity of the wise one, they risk arrogance or detachment. True wisdom, Jung taught, comes from integrating all aspects, the wise and the foolish, the light and the dark. Deep thinkers must remember that their intellect is only one function of the psyche. Feeling, sensing, and relating are equally vital. Otherwise they become unbalanced, trapped in mind, disconnected from life. Still, it is through thinking that they serve humanity. In a world addicted to speed and noise, they preserve depth. They remind us that life is not a checklist, but a mystery to be understood. Their insights challenge the collective to reflect, to slow down, to see beneath appearances. Jung often emphasized that society evolves when individuals confront their unconscious. Deep thinkers do this naturally. Their inner work ripples outward, influencing art, philosophy, and culture. They are the unseen architects of meaning. To live as a deep thinker, then, is to accept both blessing and burden. It means walking through life with an inner compass tuned to truth rather than approval. It means enduring loneliness for the sake of authenticity. It means knowing that the mind, when aligned with the soul, becomes not a prison but a temple. Jung's psychology teaches that our greatest potential lies in understanding ourselves, and deep thinkers embody that principle. They turn introspection into transformation. Their lives may seem quiet, but their minds are revolutions unfolding in silence. Part 2. The shadow side of deep thinking. The mind of a deep thinker can be both a sanctuary and a prison. What gives them insight, also gives them torment. Jung believed that every light casts a shadow, and the more intense the light, the darker the shadow. Deep thinkers, because they live in the domain of the mind, often face an inner darkness that most people never encounter. Their intellect can illuminate truth, but it can also isolate them from life. Their capacity to analyze reality deeply can become the very thing that distances them from its warmth. To understand the shadow of deep thinking, we must look at the Jungian concept of psychic inflation. When the intellect grows too powerful, it can overpower the rest of the psyche. The ego begins to identify with its own mental creations, believing it has full control over meaning. Jung warned that this leads to detachment from instinct, emotion, and embodiment. Deep thinkers may start to live almost entirely in their heads, analyzing instead of experiencing, explaining instead of feeling. They become, as Jung described spiritually, one-sided, dominated by logos, the masculine principle of logic and reason, while neglecting eros, the principle of connection and feeling. This imbalance is subtle but dangerous. A person who lives only through thought may mistake awareness for integration. They might believe that understanding an emotion equals healing it, but Jung emphasized that consciousness alone doesn't transform the psyche, experience does. The deep thinker's shadow emerges when they replace genuine emotional processing with intellectual dissection. They analyze pain until it loses all vitality. They rationalize heartbreak until it no longer hurts but also no longer teaches. In doing so, they lose contact with the very life force that fuels growth. Another aspect of their shadow is over-identification with the observer. Deep thinkers are exceptional at watching themselves, their motives, fears, and reactions. This self-observation can evolve into self-alienation. They become spectators of their own lives, paralyzed by the constant awareness of every detail. Jung compared this to the serpent that eats its own tail, a symbol of infinite self-reflection. While introspection is necessary for individuation, obsession with it can become narcissistic in the Jungian sense, not vanity, but a fixation on one's inner world to the exclusion of the outer one. They may lose spontaneity. Every feeling becomes a hypothesis, every desire a concept. They start interpreting life rather than living it. This internalization, if unchecked, leads to existential exhaustion. Jung observed that when thought becomes compulsive, it drains libido, the psychic energy that animates life. The person becomes mentally sharp, but emotionally anemic. They can describe love in detail, yet feel none of it. They can diagnose their own neurosis, but remain trapped inside it. Deep thinkers also struggle with existential isolation. Their perception of reality often outpaces those around them. They see motives beneath behavior patterns, behind chaos, truth hidden in contradiction. But this clarity creates loneliness. Few can follow their mental pathways, and fewer still can meet them at that depth. Jung would say that their consciousness has differentiated beyond the collective, a necessary step toward individuation, yet also a painful one. The more differentiated a psyche becomes, the less it belongs anywhere. This is the paradox of enlightenment: to see too much is to stand apart. The shadow manifests in subtle forms. It shows up as cynicism, the armor of a mind that once cared too deeply. It shows up as perfectionism, the illusion that if they think long enough they can avoid pain. It appears as chronic indecision, because every choice opens a dozen new interpretations. The deep thinker's intellect, once a tool of understanding, turns into a labyrinth. Each corridor of reasoning leads to another question, another doubt. They seek absolute clarity in a world built on ambiguity. Jung would call this the neurosis of the thinking type, the compulsion to resolve contradiction through logic rather than acceptance. There is also the danger of intellectual pride, the ego's secret satisfaction in being more insightful than others. Jung noted that when an individual discovers psychological truth, the ego quickly claims ownership of it. Deep thinkers may unconsciously use their intelligence to create distance, seeing others as shallow or unawakened. This superiority, though often unspoken, isolates them further. They begin to confuse depth with worth, as if complexity were proof of enlightenment. But in Jungian psychology, wisdom is measured not by intellect, but by integration, the union of opposites within the self. The most profound mind can still be spiritually immature if it rejects emotion, embodiment, or community. Another dark side of deep thinking is the addiction to meaning. Jung observed that when the psyche loses contact with instinctual life, it seeks compensation through the intellect. Deep thinkers often chase meaning as if it were oxygen. They analyze every experience, every dream, every relationship for significance. But this search can become compulsive, stripping life of its natural flow. Not every event carries cosmic importance. Sometimes a sunset is just light fading. Yet the deep thinker, haunted by the unconscious need for coherence, cannot let it be. They assign meaning where there is none because emptiness feels intolerable. This addiction reflects a deeper fear, the fear of chaos. Jung wrote that the human psyche naturally strives for order, but too much order suffocates creativity. The deep thinker's obsession with understanding becomes a defense against the unpredictability of life. They would rather dissect pain than feel it. They would rather analyze love than risk it. But this safety comes at a high cost, a disconnection from the raw vitality that Jung associated with the instinctual self. When intellect dominates the inner animal, the earthy, spontaneous, emotional part of the psyche starves. Many deep thinkers experience periods of melancholy or depression, which Jung viewed not merely as pathology, but as messages from the soul. Depression, he said, is the unconscious withdrawing energy from the conscious attitude. When life becomes too mental, too detached, the psyche compensates by shutting down. It forces the individual to stop thinking and start feeling. In this way, depression can be an invitation to descend, to return to the body, to the heart, to the forgotten instincts. But until they understand this, the deep thinker may interpret it as failure, not transformation. The shadow also expresses itself through over-analysis of morality and self-worth. Deep thinkers constantly evaluate their own motives. While this can lead to self-awareness, it can also breed guilt and paralysis. Jung pointed out that the more consciousness expands, the more the individual becomes aware of their shadow. The deep thinker sees not only their virtues but their contradictions. They realize how fragmented, inconsistent, and even hypocritical they can be. Without compassion, this awareness turns into self-contempt. They may feel morally responsible for everything: their thoughts, others' pain, even collective suffering. In the extreme, they internalize the world's chaos as personal failure. In relationships, the shadow appears as detachment disguised as depth. They crave intimacy but analyze it until it disappears. They seek understanding yet unconsciously fear the vulnerability it requires. Jung noted that the thinking type often struggles with emotional reciprocity because feeling is their inferior function, undeveloped and repressed. What they cannot integrate inwardly, they project outwardly. Thus, they may attract partners who embody their neglected emotions, passionate, impulsive, or expressive individuals. These relationships are magnetic but turbulent because they mirror the thinker's own unacknowledged shadow. The danger intensifies when the deep thinker equates logic with control. Jung emphasized that the unconscious cannot be dominated by reason. It must be related to symbolically through dream art imagination. But the overthinking mind treats the unconscious as a problem to solve. It interprets instead of dialogues. It dissects dreams as if they were equations. This intellectual aggression suppresses the natural flow of psychic energy. Over time, the unconscious retaliates through anxiety, nightmares, or creative blockages. The more the ego tries to control, the more chaos erupts from below. Jung compared this to a dam resisting a flood. The more tightly it holds, the greater the eventual collapse. Another manifestation of the shadow is spiritual bypassing through intellect. Deep thinkers often confuse awareness with transcendence. They believe that by understanding pain they have transcended it. But Jung warned that insight without transformation is merely decoration for the ego. True individuation requires embodiment, feeling, acting, risking. Many deep thinkers live as if enlightenment were a mental achievement. They forget that the psyche demands balance between spirit and matter, thought and flesh. When they neglect this, their wisdom becomes sterile, beautiful but lifeless. The inner voice of the shadow whispers in subtle ways, "If I understand more, I'll finally be safe. If I think harder, I won't be hurt again." But the unconscious is not a system to master. It is a living reality that humbles anyone who enters it. Jung believed that only those who confront their shadow, not just intellectually but experientially, achieve psychological maturity. For deep thinkers, this means descending from the mind into the heart, from knowledge into humility. Their challenge is to integrate emotion, instinct, and relationship into their intellectual clarity. The irony is that many of the deep thinkers' wounds stem from their own gift. Their depth isolates them. Their awareness magnifies their suffering. They cannot unknow what they have seen. Jung described such people as those who are called to carry more consciousness than the average person. But the price of that consciousness is solitude. The shadow of wisdom is loneliness, the feeling of standing at the edge of humanity, watching others live unconsciously while you bear the burden of understanding. This loneliness can either crush them or refine them, depending on whether they resist it or accept it as part of their path. There is also a collective aspect to this shadow. In modern culture, intelligence is glorified but rarely integrated. Society values productivity over reflection, yet rewards intellectual superiority. Deep thinkers caught between these values often feel alienated from both worlds, too introspective for the practical and too rational for the spiritual. Jung would say they are living symbols of a collective imbalance, a world that has lost connection to its own depths. Their personal shadow mirrors humanity's collective shadow, the overvaluation of intellect and the neglect of soul. When a deep thinker represses their feeling side, they often project it outward in distorted forms. They might become fascinated with emotional art, tragic stories, or people who express what they cannot. Jung called this the anima projection in men and the animus projection in women, the projection of one's inner opposite onto others. The thinker falls in love with someone who embodies what they lack, not realizing that the real task is to integrate that energy within. This is why relationships often awaken the deepest conflicts in such people, because the soul is using love as a mirror to reveal what the mind has ignored. The shadow of deep thinking, then, is not evil, it is unfinished integration. The same mind that can explore the cosmos must also learn to inhabit the body. The same intellect that can analyze the unconscious must also surrender to it. Jung's model of individuation demands that every one-sided development eventually confront its opposite. For the deep thinker, that opposite is feeling embodiment and surrender. They must learn to let meaning arise naturally rather than extract it forcefully. Only then does thought become wisdom and knowledge become light. The greatest danger, Jung warned, is when the intellect replaces the soul. The deep thinker addicted to control through understanding may lose touch with the irrational, the source of creativity, love, and transformation. When life becomes too explainable, it loses its mystery. And without mystery, there is no wonder, only sterile clarity. The task of the deep thinker is not to kill chaos with thought, but to befriend it. Only then can their depth serve life rather than drain it. Part 3. Deep thinkers and the collective unconscious. Carl Jung proposed that beneath the personal unconscious, our forgotten memories, private fears and desires, lies a deeper stratum shared by all humanity, the collective unconscious. It contains the ancient psychic patterns he called archetypes that shape how we dream, create myths, and interpret life. Deep thinkers whose attention naturally turns inward are unusually attuned to this realm. Their reflections are not only personal, they echo the mind of the species itself. Because they live close to the symbolic layer of the psyche, deep thinkers often perceive meanings before they can articulate them. They sense atmospheres, coincidences, or intuitions that seem to arrive from nowhere. Jung would describe this as the activity of archetypes pressing upward into consciousness. For example, a deep thinker absorbed in solitude may suddenly imagine a wise old figure offering counsel. That figure is not fantasy. It is the archetype of the sage emerging from the collective unconscious to guide the ego. In such moments, thought becomes mythic. Ideas carry emotional weight because they are charged with psychic energy. This sensitivity explains why deep thinkers are drawn to philosophy, religion, art, and symbolism. They instinctively seek the universal in the personal. When they analyze their own experiences, they are also interpreting humanity's story. The loss of a loved one becomes a meditation on mortality itself. A private dream becomes an allegory of the human soul. Their reflections are never merely about me, they are about the pattern that me represents. Jung called this symbolic mode of perception, seeing through a way of looking at the world that perceives images of the soul behind concrete events. However, contact with the collective unconscious is double-edged. It can inspire genius or unleash chaos. Jung warned that when archetypal contents rise too quickly, they can overwhelm the ego with visions, compulsions, or inflated certainty. The deep thinker walks a fine line between revelation and disintegration. Their challenge is to mediate the vast energy of the collective without being consumed by it. This is why grounding practices, art, journaling, physical movement are essential. They help translate the symbolic into form, giving shape to what would otherwise flood the psyche. The collective unconscious also explains the sense of timeless déjà vu that deep thinkers often feel. When they read ancient texts or encounter myths from distant cultures, they recognize themselves in them. The story of Prometheus stealing fire or of Buddha leaving his palace mirrors their own quest for illumination. These myths persist because they describe recurring psychic dramas. Jung argued that archetypes are not inherited ideas but inherited possibilities of experience. When a deep thinker struggles with solitude, they are enacting the archetype of the hermit. When they seek truth at all costs, they embody the seeker or sage. Knowing this gives their suffering dignity. It is not meaningless but mythic. Their attunement to collective symbols also makes deep thinkers prophetic in a subtle way. They often sense cultural shifts before they become visible. Artists, writers, and philosophers serve as antennae for the unconscious of the age. Jung saw this in Nietzsche, who intuited the spiritual crisis of modernity decades before it erupted. Likewise, many modern deep thinkers feel a vague anxiety about technology, consumerism, or spiritual emptiness long before society admits it. They pick up the psychic vibrations of the collective because their inner receivers are tuned to that frequency. This capacity can feel burdensome, carrying emotions that aren't entirely their own, but it also positions them as healers of culture. Their dreams often reveal this collective dimension. While ordinary people dream of daily concerns, deep thinkers dream in symbols, ancient temples, oceans, serpents, journeys through caves. These are not random, they are universal motifs, expressing the psyche's timeless language. Jung emphasized that learning to interpret dreams symbolically allows one to converse with the collective unconscious consciously. For deep thinkers, dream work becomes an extension of thinking itself, philosophy conducted through images instead of words. Yet their relationship with the collective can turn pathological when they identify with its contents. When a thinker begins to see themselves as a prophet, a savior, or a vessel of absolute truth, the ego has merged with an archetype, a state Jung called inflation. The person believes they are the symbol instead of a participant in it. This can lead to fanaticism or detachment from reality. Healthy depth requires humility, recognizing that archetypes are larger than any individual. The deep thinker must serve the symbol, not possess it. The collective unconscious also offers a paradoxical comfort. Though deep thinkers often feel isolated, Jung would remind them that they are never truly alone. Their solitude is shared by every soul that has ever sought meaning. When they reflect on existence, they join a lineage of minds stretching back to the dawn of awareness. In this sense, thinking deeply is an act of communion with humanity's ongoing conversation with itself. They are part of the same inner dialogue that shaped the myths of Egypt, the philosophies of Greece, the scriptures of India. Each question they ask has been asked 1,000 times before in different tongues, and each answer adds another voice to the chorus of the collective mind. The connection to the collective unconscious also explains the moral burden deep thinkers feel. They sense that ideas have consequences beyond the personal. When they explore shadow, they touch not only their own darkness but that of the world. They may experience collective guilt, grief, or rage without knowing why. Jung called this participation mystique, an unconscious identification with the psychic field of the group. Only by bringing these feelings to awareness can they distinguish what belongs to them from what belongs to humanity. Otherwise, they drown in emotions that are not entirely their own. From a Jungian perspective, the task of the deep thinker is to mediate between the collective unconscious and the collective consciousness. They translate instinct and symbol into language that others can understand. They are bridges between chaos and order, between dream and daylight. Every philosopher who articulates a new worldview, every poet who captures the spirit of an era, performs this mediating role. They do not invent truth, they reveal what was already latent in the collective psyche. This mediating function explains the peculiar exhaustion many deep thinkers feel after creative or intellectual breakthroughs. When they channel ideas larger than themselves, they expend enormous psychic energy. The archetype uses them as an instrument, and afterward they feel empty, as if the muse has departed. Jung experienced this while writing the Red Book, where he recorded visions that felt dictated by forces beyond his control. He learned that such encounters require recovery, returning to ordinary life, grounding in the senses, re-entering relationship. Without that, one becomes lost in archetypal inflation. The collective unconscious also offers a key to empathy. Because deep thinkers perceive the symbolic unity beneath individual stories, they can feel compassion even for those very different from themselves. They understand that human cruelty, love, ambition, and fear are variations of timeless patterns. This doesn't make them detached, it makes them patient. They see in every person a fragment of the whole. Jung wrote that individuation does not isolate the individual, it connects them more profoundly to humanity. True thinking leads not to elitism but to service. To live with this awareness requires discipline. The deep thinker must learn symbolic literacy, how to interpret archetypal images without literalizing them. They must also cultivate what Jung called the transcendent function, holding the tension between opposites until a new synthesis emerges. In practical terms, this means balancing intellect with imagination, reason with intuition, solitude with community. Each polarity represents a pair of archetypal energies, seeking reconciliation through consciousness. By embodying that reconciliation, the deep thinker furthers collective evolution. Ultimately, the relationship between deep thinkers and the collective unconscious is symbiotic. The collective provides them with raw material, myths, dreams, intuitions, while they provide the collective with form and interpretation. They are translators of the soul's language into human speech. Through them, the unconscious learns about itself. Every essay, theory, or artwork born from true reflection is an offering from the depths to the surface of civilization. Part 4. The individuation of the deep mind. In Jungian psychology, individuation is the process through which a person becomes whole, a gradual reconciliation between the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche. For deep thinkers, this is not just a psychological journey, it is their natural calling. Their intellect, which explores ideas and symbols with precision, is both the tool and the obstacle in this process. They must learn that true wisdom does not come from analyzing life, but from integrating its opposites, mind and body, thought and feeling, logic and intuition, solitude and connection. Deep thinkers begin this journey in the realm of abstraction. Their minds are built to dissect and understand. Yet the first step toward individuation demands something radically different: surrender. The intellect must accept that it cannot think its way to wholeness. Jung wrote that the ego is like a spotlight. It illuminates what it focuses on, but leaves everything else in shadow. Individuation requires expanding that light until it embraces what the ego would rather ignore. For a deep thinker, this means descending from analysis into embodiment, from observation into participation. The first confrontation is usually with the shadow. Deep thinkers often believe their awareness protects them from darkness. They imagine that by naming their flaws they have conquered them. But the shadow is not something we outthink, it is something we must feel, confess, and integrate. For them, this can be humbling. Their superior function thinking becomes useless in front of raw emotion or instinct. They meet the parts of themselves that logic cannot domesticate: jealousy, fear, lust, vulnerability. The more they resist, the stronger the shadow grows. Jung warned that what we resist not only persists, but grows in size. Only by acknowledging their shadow without judgment can they reclaim the life energy trapped within it. As they integrate the shadow, deep thinkers encounter the anima or animus, the inner opposite. For a man dominated by intellect, the anima appears as his neglected emotional life, symbolized through dreams or relationships with women who embody feeling, sensuality, or chaos. For a woman whose mind dominates, the animus emerges as inner conviction, assertive thought, or the image of a wise man who challenges her beliefs. These figures are not mere fantasies, they are personifications of the psyche's lost halves. Individuation demands a dialogue with them. Deep thinkers must learn to listen to their dreams, to trust intuition, to allow the irrational to have a voice. Only then do they become whole rather than split between mind and soul. The process often unfolds through crisis. Jung emphasized that growth rarely occurs in comfort. When life shatters their intellectual order through heartbreak, failure, or illness, the deep thinker faces an initiation. Their old worldview built on certainty collapses. The ego realizes it cannot control the forces of the unconscious. This collapse is not punishment, it is alchemy. Individuation always involves a symbolic death, the death of the knowing mind. What rises afterward is not ignorance but wisdom, a consciousness that no longer seeks to dominate experience but to cooperate with it. Through this death they encounter what Jung called the self, the organizing principle of the psyche. Unlike the ego, which says, "I think," the self whispers, "I am." It is both personal and transpersonal, a bridge between the individual and the universal. Deep thinkers feel this presence as intuition, synchronicity, or an inner voice that speaks with quiet authority. The task now is to align the intellect with this deeper intelligence. The mind becomes a servant of the soul rather than its ruler. Thoughts no longer orbit around control but around meaning and participation in something greater. Individuation also transforms the deep thinker's relationship with others. Jung observed that individuation does not isolate the individual, it makes authentic relationship possible. Before integration, deep thinkers relate to projections their shadow, anima, or ideals cast onto other people. Once those projections are withdrawn, they begin to see others as whole beings, not mirrors of their psyche. Connection becomes cleaner, freer, less manipulative. They no longer seek validation for their intellect or rescue from their loneliness. They meet others as equals in the shared mystery of being conscious. Their solitude becomes communion. Creativity, too, changes form. Before individuation, deep thinkers use creativity to express intellect. Afterward, creativity becomes revelation and expression of the self. Jung described true art as a living being that uses the artist as its instrument. The individuated thinker no longer forces meaning, but allows it to emerge. Their ideas feel given rather than manufactured. This surrender marks the transformation from mind as master to mind as vessel. The thinker becomes a participant in the unfolding of universal consciousness. One of the most difficult stages is reconciliation with the body. Because deep thinkers inhabit their minds, they often treat the body as secondary, a machine to maintain rather than a source of wisdom. Individuation reverses this hierarchy. The body becomes a symbolic terrain where unconscious material manifests tension, illness, appetite, fatigue. Jung believed the body is the psyche's shadow. What the mind refuses to face, the body expresses. When deep thinkers learn to listen to walk, dance, breathe, and rest consciously, they discover that embodiment is not distraction but revelation. The instinctual life they once feared becomes an ally, grounding their insight in lived experience. Over time, individuation teaches them to embrace paradox. They stop dividing the world into right and wrong, light and dark, rational and irrational. They begin to see that opposites define each other. Just as day reveals night, logic gives meaning to emotion, and solitude deepens relationship. Jung called this the transcendent function, the psychic capacity to hold tension until a new synthesis emerges. Deep thinkers, once enslaved by dualities, now live in fluidity. They can think and feel, analyze and surrender, teach and learn simultaneously. Their mind becomes a vessel of wholeness rather than fragmentation. This process also brings reconciliation with time. Earlier in life, deep thinkers live in abstraction, lost in memory or speculation. Individuation roots them in the present. Jung wrote that the self is experienced as a timeless center, a consciousness that witnesses without anxiety. The individuated thinker moves through life with a quiet trust that events unfold according to a deeper order. Coincidences, losses, and meetings feel orchestrated by meaning rather than chance. This trust does not eliminate struggle but transforms it into participation with the unfolding psyche of the world. The ethical dimension of individuation is profound. Jung believed that a person who becomes conscious contributes to the healing of humanity. Every insight integrated into one psyche reduces collective unconsciousness. The individuated deep thinker thus carries a moral responsibility to live truthfully, to embody the wisdom they discover, and to communicate it in language others can understand. Their thoughts are no longer private. They are offerings to the collective. Philosophy, art, or teaching becomes sacred service. Individuation also liberates them from perfectionism. They no longer strive to be pure intellects or flawless beings. They understand that wholeness includes imperfection. The cracks in their logic, the failures of their relationships, the doubts in their faith all belong. Jung often used the image of the mandala to represent the self, a circle containing asymmetrical patterns. Each imperfection contributes to harmony. For the deep thinker, this realization brings peace. They no longer chase absolute truth. They live with living truth, fluid, evolving, incomplete. The mind that once dissected everything now rests in paradox. The individuated deep thinker begins to recognize meaning as participatory. Reality is not a puzzle to solve, but a conversation to join. They no longer seek to impose frameworks on the world. They listen for the world's invitation to understanding. Their thoughts become porous to intuition, art, and silence. Jung wrote that meaning makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything. The deep thinker who has individuated carries this meaning effortlessly, radiating coherence without argument. In practical life, they appear calmer, humbler, even simpler. They still think deeply, but their thoughts serve life rather than replace it. They can garden, cook, or laugh without dissecting every experience. Their intellect becomes transparent, like clear water, reflecting the sky. The difference is not less intelligence, but greater integration, the realization that wisdom and play, philosophy and compassion belong to the same continuum of consciousness. Individuation does not end, it deepens. Jung emphasized that it continues as long as one lives. For deep thinkers, this means thought never stops evolving, but the motivation changes. They no longer think to escape ignorance. They think to celebrate mystery. The mind that once defended the ego now serves the soul. Insight becomes an act of love, not of control. The deep mind, when individuated, becomes luminous with humility. It knows that the ultimate task is not to explain the universe, but to participate in its unfolding. You are not overthinking, you are awakening. The depth you carry is not a burden, it's a gift. Jung taught that the mind's true purpose is not to escape life, but to make it meaningful. Remember, the deeper you go within, the more clearly you see the world outside. Keep thinking deeply. Keep walking toward wholeness. If this resonated with you, share it with someone whose mind also refuses to live on the surface.